Somewhere in America right now, a 26-year-old with a good job, a decent savings account, and a functioning credit score is being told by every adult in his life that he needs to buy a house. His parents are saying it, his co-workers are saying it, his girlfriend's parents are definitely saying it, and he keeps nodding, smiling, and then going home to his rental and opening his brokerage account instead. Here is what's interesting. He is not lazy, he is not broke, he is not afraid of commitment. He has done the math, and the math told him something that decades of conventional wisdom forgot to mention. Meanwhile, the home ownership rate for people under 35 just hit its lowest point since the government started tracking it. Rent applications are up, single family home purchases by Gen Z are down, and the real estate industry is genuinely confused because they build the entire sales pitch around one assumption that every generation would eventually want what the last generation wanted. That assumption just broke. So the question is, what does a 20-something know that the rest of the culture is pretending not to see? We are going to explain exactly how the home ownership system works, why it rewarded the people it rewarded for the last 50 years, and why the math underneath it has quietly changed in a way that most people are too emotionally invested to admit. This is not a video about renting being better than buying in some abstract philosophical sense. This is a video about incentives, systems, and who the current structure of home ownership actually benefits. Because I promise you, it is not who you think. Here is the metaphor I want you to hold on to for the entire video. Think of home ownership like an escalator. For most of the 20th century, stepping onto that escalator was the single most reliable wealth building move available to ordinary people. You bought your ticket, you stepped on, and the escalator moved you upward automatically. You did not have to be smart, you did not have to be strategic. You just had to get on, the escalator did the rest. That escalator still exists. The problem is that somewhere around 2012, the price of the ticket tripled, and the escalator started moving sideways in some cities and backward in others, and the people already on it, the people who bought their ticket for $40 back in 1990, they are looking down at the people trying to buy in now and saying, why won't you just get on the escalator? It worked for me. Are you too good for escalators? And the honest answer, the one nobody wants to say out loud at Thanksgiving dinner, is it is not that we are too good for escalators. It is that the ticket now costs $420,000, and we have done the math on what else $420,000 can do. Let's start from the beginning, because the beginning is where the confusion lives. The story of home ownership in America is actually a story about a very specific set of government policies that created a very specific set of incentives. It is not a natural law. It is not a universal truth. It is an engineered outcome. And if you understand that it was engineered, then you can also understand that when the engineering changes, the outcome changes. After World War II, the federal government made a deliberate decision to make home ownership the default vehicle for middle-class wealth accumulation. They did this through the GI Bill, which gave returning soldiers access to low-interest home loans. They did it through the creation of 30-year fixed mortgages, which spread payments out long enough to make them feel affordable. They did it through the mortgage interest tax deduction, which made buying literally cheaper than renting in a lot of markets at the time. They did it through highway infrastructure, which opened up suburban land. They did it through zoning laws that restricted the density of housing supply in desirable areas, which created artificial scarcity. This was a machine. Every piece of this machine was designed and installed intentionally, and together those pieces produced a very predictable output, rising home values, broad middle-class wealth accumulation, and a culture that treated buying a house not as a financial decision, but as a moral milestone. And here is the thing. It worked. For a generation that bought homes in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the escalator moved upward and it moved fast. A guy who bought a house in suburban California in 1972 for $32,000 and sold it in 2004 for $600,000 did not make that money because he was a genius. He made it because he stepped on the escalator at the right time, and the escalator happened to be moving in an extremely good direction. But here is what the system also did and nobody talks about. It created an entire culture around that escalator. Books, movies, the American dream narrative, the way real estate agents are trained to sell, the way parents talk to their children, the way banks structure their advertising, all of it got built on top of the assumption that the escalator would always move upward and that getting on it early was always the right move. And that cultural machine is still running perfectly, loudly, even though the financial machine underneath it has fundamentally changed. Now let's talk about what actually changed. Because this is where most people stop and say something vague like, homes are too expensive now, and leave it there. That is true, but it is not the whole picture. The real story is about the relationship between three numbers: home prices, wages, and interest rates, and how that relationship has shifted into something that the escalator metaphor was never built to handle. In 1980, the median American home price was somewhere around $63,000. The median household income was around $21,000. That is a price to income ratio of about 3 to 1. You could buy a median home for roughly 3 years of your household income. That is a real number. That is what made the escalator accessible. By 2006, right before the financial crisis, the median home price had climbed to about $220,000, while median household income had grown to around $48,000. That ratio had expanded to a little over 4.5 to 1. It was getting stretched, but it was still manageable, especially with the low interest rate environment that was running at the time. Now look at where we are in early 2026. Median home prices in the United States are sitting somewhere around $420,000. Median household income is around $78,000. That is a price to income ratio of roughly 5.5 to 1. And in the major metropolitan areas where most high paying jobs are actually located, Seattle, Austin, New York, Denver, Miami, that ratio is not 5.5 to 1, it is 8 to 1, 9 to 1. In some San Francisco suburbs, it is close to 12 to 1. What does that mean in practice? It means that a young professional making $75,000 a year, which is genuinely a good salary for someone in their mid-20s, would need to spend roughly 6 years of their entire gross income just to afford the median home in the country, not in a coastal city. The median home, and that is before we factor in down payments, closing costs, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Let's do the actual math, because this is where the conversation usually gets uncomfortable. You are 24 years old, you make $75,000 a year, you have been disciplined, you have saved $35,000, you want to buy a home at the national median price of $420,000. First problem, your down payment. To avoid private mortgage insurance, which is an additional monthly fee that adds nothing to your equity, lenders typically want 20% down. 20% of $420,000 is $84,000. You have $35,000, you are $50,000 short. So right away, you are looking at years of additional saving before you can even make a competitive offer. And those years are also years during which home prices might continue rising, which is a moving target problem that gets psychologically exhausting. Let's say you find a way to scrape together the $84,000. Maybe you put in 10% down and accept the private mortgage insurance. Let's say your total down payment is $42,000, which is 10%. Your loan amount is $378,000. At the current average 30-year fixed mortgage rate, which in early 2026 is sitting somewhere around 6.8%, your monthly payment is around $2,470, just on principal and interest. Add property taxes. In most states, property taxes on a $420,000 home run, somewhere between $4,000 and $8,000 annually. Let's call it $5,000, which is conservative. That is about $417 per month. Add homeowners insurance, call it around $180 per month. Add private mortgage insurance, since you only put 10% down. That is another $180 to $200 per month. Add maintenance. Real estate professionals will tell you to budget 1 to 2% of your home's value per year for maintenance. 1% of 420 grand is $4,200 annually, or $350 per month. And that is a conservative number. The first 5 years of owning a home tend to surface every deferred problem the previous owners chose to ignore. So your total monthly cost of home ownership on a $420,000 median home is somewhere in the range of $3,600 to $3,800 per month. For a person making $75,000 a year, that is after tax take home of maybe $55,000 or roughly $4,500 per month. You are spending 80% of your take home on housing. Now compare that to the rental equivalent. A comparable house in most markets rents for somewhere between $2,200 and $2,800 per month. And when you rent, your maintenance bill is zero. Your property tax bill is zero. Your insurance is renter's insurance, which is around $15 to $20 per month. Your total monthly housing cost when renting that same property is $2,200 to $2,800. You are spending roughly 50 to 60% of your take home on housing instead of 80%. That gap, the difference between your monthly cost of ownership and your monthly cost of renting, is the unspoken cost of buying in this environment. And it is a gap that did not used to exist in this way. In 1990 or 2000 or even 2010, the rent versus buy math was genuinely close in many markets, and the long-term equity case for buying was strong enough to tip the scales. Today, in most markets, you are paying a significant premium every single month to be an owner, rather than a renter. And the justification for paying that premium has to come from somewhere. Traditionally, the justification is appreciation. The idea that your home will go up in value fast enough to make the premium worth it. The escalator will carry you up high enough that the expensive ticket feels like a bargain in hindsight. But here is the reversal that changes everything. You think the problem is that home prices are too high, but actually the problem is that the rate of appreciation that justified those prices has changed, and it changed in two specific ways that most people are not accounting for. First, interest rates. From 2008 through roughly 2021, interest rates were historically anomalously low. We are talking about periods where a 30-year mortgage was available for under 3%. That environment did two things simultaneously. It inflated home prices by making borrowing cheap, and it made the comparison to alternative investments look worse for stocks and bonds. When your savings account earns near zero, locking money into a home at a 3% mortgage feels like a reasonable deal. The house becomes the best yielding asset in the room by default. That era is over. Interest rates have normalized upward, and nobody serious in finance thinks they are going back to 2% in any near-term scenario, which means two things. Home prices, which were inflated in part by cheap borrowing, have structural pressure keeping them from rising as fast. And alternative investments, stocks, index funds, private credit, real estate investment trusts are now yielding enough to genuinely compete. Second, supply dynamics is slowly changing in a way that the real estate industry does not want to talk about loudly. Cities like Austin, Phoenix, and parts of Florida saw massive construction booms post-pandemic, and those markets experienced actual price corrections of 15 to 25% from their 22 peaks. The narrative that home prices only ever go up is not just emotionally satisfying mythology, it is also empirically questionable when you look at specific markets over specific time windows. This is where I want to stop and be careful, because I am not making the argument that home ownership is a bad investment across the board, everywhere, for everyone, forever. That would be wrong and lazy. What I am saying is that the reflexive assumption, the unexamined cultural default, that buying a home is always a smart move, that it is the foundation of wealth building, that renting is throwing money away, that assumption has always been more emotional than mathematical, and right now the math is the least favourable it has been in decades. Now here is the part that gets genuinely strange, and this is the part that most people in the home ownership conversation completely skip over. The real cost of buying a home is not what you pay every month. The real cost is what you give up. And what you give up is the opportunity to deploy that capital elsewhere. Let's go back to a hypothetical 24-year-old. He has put $42,000 into a down payment. He has also paid closing costs, which on a $420,000 home average, somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. So right away, he has taken $50 to $50 out of his liquid investable capital and locked it into a single asset, one house in one neighborhood, in one city, in one country's real estate market. Now, let's say instead of buying, he invests that $50,000 into a low-cost total market index fund. Over the last 30 years, the S&P 500 has returned an average of roughly 10 to 11% per year before inflation. Let's be conservative and say 9%. $50,000 compounded at 9% annually for 30 years becomes approximately $660,000. And remember, he is also paying $2,200 to $2,800 a month in rent instead of $3,600 to $3,800 a month in mortgage. That difference, let's call it $1,200 per month. He can also invest $1,200 per month invested at 9% annually over 30 years becomes approximately $1.8 million. Now compare that to the home ownership scenario. He bought the $420,000 house. After 30 years, he owns it outright. What is it worth? If it appreciated at the historical average for US real estate, which is around 3 to 4% annually in nominal terms, the house is worth somewhere between $1,100,000 and $1,400,000. But he also paid interest over 30 years on a $378,000 loan at 6.8% over 30 years. His total interest payments come to approximately $520,000. He paid $520,000 in interest alone on a house that was originally $420,000. He also paid property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Let's conservatively estimate those at a combined $3,000 to $4,000 annually over 30 years, which is another $90,000 to $120,000. Total money out, roughly $650,000 to $670,000 over 30 years, not counting the down payment. He also had the $54,000 locked up at the start. He ends up with an asset worth $1.1 to $1.4 million. The renter-investor scenario ends up with approximately $2,400,000 in invested assets. With no house, yes, but with dramatically more liquid, diversified wealth. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the renter still has to pay rent forever. The homeowner eventually stops paying. And that is a real point. Shelter is a cost that continues indefinitely. But here is the thing. If you have $2.4 million in a portfolio yielding even 4% annually in dividends or returns, that is $96,000 per year. You can rent for the rest of your life and call it a cost of living, just like electricity. You are not trapped. You are not illiquid. You can move cities. You can move countries. You are not one job loss away from missing a mortgage payment. I want to be clear about something, because this is the part where somebody in the comments will say that I am cherry picking assumptions. And that is fair. The math I just did is simplified. Real life has taxes, real estate market variance, different return assumptions, market timing, rent increases over time, and about 40 other variables. I am not saying the renter always wins by exactly that amount. I am saying the gap between buying and investing is much closer than the culture lets on. And in many specific scenarios with current prices and current rates, renting and investing genuinely outperforms buying even over long time horizons. That is a statement that would have been considered borderline insane 20 years ago, and it is now mainstream finance. And that is why Gen Z is turning away from home ownership. Not because they are irresponsible, not because they are commitment phobic, not because they want to spend money on avocado toast and concerts. They are turning away because they did the math, or they watched someone do the math on YouTube, or they read a Reddit thread where someone laid out the numbers. And the math, for a lot of them, in a lot of markets, does not close. Let me take a quick step back and explain the psychological layer of this, because incentives do not operate in a vacuum. They operate inside human psychology, and the psychological shift in Gen Z around home ownership is just as important as the mathematical one. Gen Z watched something happen that no other generation watched from that particular vantage point. They watched the 2008 financial crisis from childhood. The average Gen Z person was born between 1997 and 2012. The 2008 crisis happened when they were between approximately 0 and 11 years old. They did not experience it as adults making financial decisions. They experienced it as children, watching their parents go through it. Watching adults they trusted lose their homes, their savings, their sense of financial security. And the asset at the center of all that, the thing that was supposed to be safe, the thing their parents had bet everything on, was a house. That is a formative experience. It rewires how a generation emotionally relates to the concept of a single illiquid asset as a primary store of wealth. You do not have to have read a finance book to absorb the lesson that concentrating your entire financial life into one leveraged bet on the real estate market carries a specific kind of catastrophic downside risk. Then those same kids grew up in the 20-teens and watched a different phenomenon. They watched the internet create wealth. They watched people build software businesses and sell them. They watched crypto go from nothing to something and back to something else. They watched people buy Tesla stock in 2019 and become wealthy by 2021. They watched the explosion of index fund investing, of Roth IRAs, of fractional shares, of platforms where a 20-year-old could buy a piece of an apartment complex through a real estate investment trust without a down payment or a mortgage or a plumber. The available menu of wealth building vehicles expanded dramatically. And the house sitting at the top of that menu with its $420,000 price tag and its 6.8% mortgage rate started to look like a very expensive, very illiquid, very maintenance-heavy option compared to everything else on the menu. And Gen Z, broadly, made a rational choice to look at other things on the menu. Not all of them, not forever, but more of them earlier in life than any previous generation. And that shift is structural, not temporary. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. I make videos that are specifically about how wealth-building systems work, why they reward certain behaviors, and what changes when the rules of the game shift. No motivation, no get rich quick, just the actual mechanics. Now let's go one level deeper, because everything I have talked about so far is essentially a financial argument. Prices went up, rates went up, opportunity costs went up, and all of that is true. But the reason this is actually a profound structural shift, not just a market cycle, has to do with something more fundamental than any of those numbers. It has to do with who the current system was designed to serve and how the answer to that question has changed. The escalator metaphor from the beginning of this video, remember it, because here is something interesting about escalators. They are designed to move in one direction. They reward the people who are already on them, and the people who built them got to decide who could afford the ticket. The modern home ownership system is a system with a very specific set of beneficiaries that are not necessarily the people buying the homes. Let me explain what I mean. First beneficiary, the existing homeowners. If you bought a home 10, 15 or 20 years ago, rising home prices are unambiguously good for you. You are sitting on an appreciating asset. Every policy decision that restricts new housing supply, zoning laws that prevent apartment construction, building codes that increase costs, permit processes that slow development, those policies protect your asset value. The people who already own homes have a direct financial incentive to restrict the supply of new homes. And in local politics, homeowners vote in higher numbers and organise more effectively than renters. This is not a conspiracy theory, it is a straightforward incentive analysis. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is essentially the political manifestation of existing homeowners protecting their asset class by restricting supply. And it works. And it has worked for decades. And it is one of the primary structural reasons why housing supply has remained constrained in desirable markets, even as demand has grown. Second beneficiary, the banking system. A 30-year mortgage is one of the most profitable products a bank sells. Over the life of that loan, they collect roughly 130% of the original loan amount in interest. The borrower takes all the risk of a declining market. The bank takes its interest payments regardless. The securitization of mortgages, packaging them into financial instruments and selling them, means banks can originate loans, collect fees, sell the risk to investors, and then do it again. The financial system is structurally incentivized to keep people with long-term mortgage debt. The entire real estate finance industry, appraisers, mortgage brokers, title companies, insurance underwriters, makes money only when homes are bought and sold. Not when homes are rented, not when people stay liquid and invest in index funds. The entire industry has a financial interest in perpetuating the cultural narrative that buying is always right. Third beneficiary, local governments. Property taxes are one of the primary funding mechanisms for municipal governments and school districts. Higher property values mean higher property tax revenue. Local governments benefit directly from rising home prices. They are also incentivized to maintain or increase home values, which often means restricting supply. There is a structural alignment between homeowner interests, local government interests, and rising prices, and that alignment has been in place for decades, producing the exact environment we are now living in. So when you look at the cultural pressure to buy a home, the parental advice, the real estate industry messaging, the way the tax code still has a mortgage interest deduction, the way are you a homeowner is treated as a demographic proxy for being a responsible adult. That pressure is not random. It is the output of a set of systems that benefit from people buying homes. The escalator exists because a lot of people get paid to sell tickets to the escalator. And Gen Z, as a generation that grew up with access to financial information that previous generations did not have, is increasingly aware of this alignment. They are asking a question that their parents generally did not think to ask. Whose interests does this system actually serve? That question leads to uncomfortable places. And one of the most uncomfortable places it leads is the realization that renting is throwing money away. Possibly the most repeated piece of financial folk wisdom in American culture is not a financial argument. It is a marketing slogan. Think about it for a second. When you pay rent, you exchange money for a thing of value, housing, with no maintenance responsibility, no capital risk, and full flexibility to leave. When you pay a mortgage, the majority of your early payments, because of how amortization works, go to interest, not equity. Interest. In the first year of a standard 30-year mortgage, roughly 80 to 85% of every payment goes to the bank, not to your equity. You are, in very literal terms, throwing money at the bank for the privilege of maybe building equity later if the market cooperates. That is not a reason to not buy a home. Equity does accumulate over time. The math can work in your favor. I am not arguing that home ownership is always wrong. I am arguing that the framing of renting is throwing money away is intellectually dishonest in a way that serves the interests of the people selling mortgages, not the people taking them out. The honest version of the statement is renting is exchanging money for a service. Buying is exchanging money for equity plus interest plus maintenance plus illiquidity plus market risk plus flexibility cost. Whether that trade-off is worth it depends entirely on your specific market, your specific timeline, your specific alternative uses of the capital, and your specific life situation. Gen Z broadly is the first generation to have that framing available to them at scale. And when you have that framing, the automatic, emotional, culturally mandated decision to buy starts to look like what it actually is, a decision with trade-offs like any other decision. Now I want to introduce a specific scenario because I think abstract arguments only go so far. Let's talk about Marcus. Marcus is 27 years old. He works in software engineering in Austin, Texas. He makes $112,000 per year. He has been at his job for 3 years. He has saved 60 grand. His company is fully remote, which means he can technically work from anywhere, but he has to stay within a certain time zone range for team coordination purposes. Everyone in Marcus's life is telling him to buy a house. Austin is a real city. He has a real job. He has enough for a down payment. His parents are borderline offended that he is renting a 2-bedroom apartment for $2,100 a month. Marcus looked at the Austin market. After the pandemic boom and the subsequent correction, Austin median home prices stabilized somewhere around $480,000 in his target neighborhoods. Areas close enough to the city core that he would not feel isolated, in school districts he cared about for theoretical future children. In neighborhoods where he believed in the long-term trajectory, he runs the math. $80,000 down payment, $400,000 loan at 6.9%, 30 years, that is approximately $2,650 in principal and interest alone. Add taxes. Austin property taxes are famously high, around 2 to 2.5% of assessed value annually. On a $480,000 home, that is roughly $10,000 to $12,000 per year. That is $800 to $1,000 per month in property taxes. Add insurance, around $200. Add maintenance budget, around $400 per month. Add private mortgage insurance, since his down payment is not quite 20%, another $150. His total monthly cost of ownership, approximately $4,200 per month. He is currently paying $2,100 a month in rent for a comparable living situation. The monthly gap between owning and renting is approximately $2,100. That is the premium he would pay every month to be a homeowner versus a renter. Over 30 years, that gap, $2,100 per month, represents approximately $756,000 in additional money spent on ownership versus renting. Now, some of that is going to principal, some of it is building equity, but not all of it, and not immediately. Marcus calculated that after accounting for equity accumulation, appreciation, and the tax benefits of ownership, he would need his Austin home to appreciate at roughly 5 to 6% annually just to break even with the renter-investor scenario, where he stays in his apartment, pays $2,100 per month, and invests the $60,000 down payment plus the $2,100 monthly difference in a portfolio earning 9% annually, 5 to 6% annual appreciation. That was the threshold. Was Austin real estate going to do that? Maybe. Austin has strong fundamentals, population growth, tech industry presence, relatively business-friendly environment. But the city had already corrected from its peak, and at the valuations Marcus was looking at, 5 to 6% annual appreciation was not a guaranteed baseline. It was a hopeful projection. Marcus decided to keep renting and investing. He invested his $60,000 down payment into a diversified index portfolio. He has been adding approximately $2,000 per month since then. He is not a homeowner. He does not feel behind. He feels, as he would describe it, liquid. He can take a job in London if one comes through. He can move to a cheaper city if Austin's job market softens. He is not anchored to one zip code by a $400,000 debt. And here is the thing about Marcus that the home ownership conversation almost never addresses. His flexibility is not free, but it is valuable. The option to move, to follow the highest paying job, to relocate to a lower cost of living area, to adapt as the economy changes, that option has real dollar value. It is not sentimentality. It is a financial asset. And it is an asset that you surrender the moment you sign a mortgage. Gen Z watched remote work normalize. They watched their older siblings and millennial colleagues get locked into cities by mortgages during a period when the job market was becoming increasingly national and global. A person who bought in San Francisco in 2019 at the peak and needed to leave for a better opportunity in 2020, one faced either a loss on the sale or the ongoing cost of carrying a property they could not easily exit. The same person who rented in San Francisco gave 30 days notice, packed their laptop, and was in Austin or Lisbon or Medellin by the following month. Flexibility has always been undervalued in financial planning because traditional financial planning was built around the assumption of a stable job in one city for 40 years. That assumption is becoming less true with every passing year. Here is a quick pause for something slightly absurd. Imagine going to a used car dealership. The salesman shows you a car. You ask the price. He says the car costs $420,000. You say that seems high. He says, well, it is a great investment. Prices only go up. You are throwing money away every month you do not own a car. Plus, your parents owned a car. Your grandparents owned a car. This is just what responsible adults do. Then he shows you the financing. You will pay 6.8% interest for 30 years, which means you will end up paying roughly $1,200,000 in total for a $420,000 car. You ask if there are other options. He looks at you like you just said you were thinking of not owning a car. And then he says, do you not believe in cars? That is not a perfect analogy. Houses do not depreciate the way cars do. They are not commodities. Land has genuine scarcity value. I know. But the structure of the conversation around home ownership, the social pressure, the implied moral failing of renting, the conflation of financial prudence with cultural abnormality does carry that flavour of a sales conversation where the salesman's interests are not transparently disclosed. Now let's talk about one of the most important second order effects of this entire shift, because this is where it gets weird in a way that most housing commentary completely misses. The traditional home ownership system did not just generate wealth for individual homeowners. It generated social capital, community stability, local investment, civic engagement. The theory, and it was a well-documented theory, was that homeowners had skin in the game. They were invested in their neighborhood, their schools, their local politics, because those things directly affected their property values. Homeowners maintained properties, organised neighbourhood associations, voted on school bond measures, showed up to city council meetings. The incentive alignment between individual financial interest and community investment was one of the intended policy features of mass home ownership. If Gen Z is turning away from home ownership at scale, that alignment breaks down. A generation of mobile renters, people who plan to be in a city for 2 to 4 years before moving on for a better opportunity, does not have the same incentive to invest deeply in local community structures. Not because they are bad people, because the incentive is not there. You do not show up to fight for the school district's budget if your kid is not going to be in that district in 2 years. You do not care deeply about the neighbour's fence if you are leaving when your lease expires. This is not a small thing. It is a structural shift in how communities organise and maintain themselves. And nobody in the housing conversation is talking about it because the policy response to Gen Z is not buying homes, has been almost entirely focused on affordability tools. First-time home buyer assistance programs, down payment grants, slight regulatory adjustments, rather than acknowledging that there might be a fundamental shift in how a generation thinks about place permanence and financial strategy. And here is the final turn. The one that I think is the least obvious and the most important. The housing market's response to lower demand from Gen Z buyers is going to create a very specific set of winners. And those winners are the people who understood early that the market was shifting. Here is the mechanism. If Gen Z is not buying homes at the rates previous generations did, and if this trend continues even as Gen Z ages into their 30s, which early data suggests it might, then the demand for owner-occupied single-family homes will grow more slowly than historical models predicted. Meanwhile, the demand for rentals will grow faster than historical models predicted, which means the people who own rental properties will do very well, which means the real estate investment trusts that own large portfolios of single-family rentals and apartment complexes will do very well, which means that the Gen Z person who said, I am not buying a house, but I am buying index funds, and those index funds include real estate investment trusts, will benefit from the very rental market they are participating in as a renter. The system creates a strange loop. Gen Z rents instead of buys. That increases demand for rentals. That increases rental income for property owners. That increases the stock price and dividend yield of real estate investment trusts. That increases the portfolio returns of Gen Z investors who hold those trusts. Gen Z is inadvertently investing in the landlord class while being the tenant class, and the investment case for both sides of that equation is being driven by the same demographic shift. Is that ironic? Yes. Is it a problem? That depends on your politics. But from a pure systems thinking standpoint, it is a fascinating self-reinforcing loop. The generation that cannot afford to buy is, through index investing, buying the companies that profit from the generation that cannot afford to buy. Institutional investors, Blackstone Invitation Homes and their equivalents, figured this out around 2012 and have been systematically purchasing single-family homes and converting them to rental units ever since. They have been criticised heavily for this, and some of that criticism is fair, but from a pure incentive standpoint, they correctly identified a structural shift, that the owner-occupied single-family home market was going to face headwinds from affordability, and they positioned capital to benefit from the rental demand that would fill that gap. They read the system correctly, even if the social consequences of their actions are genuinely complicated. The people who will build significant wealth in the next 30 years will not necessarily be the people who bought a house in the right neighborhood in 2022. They will be the people who correctly understood where the structural demand was going and positioned capital accordingly. In some markets, that does mean buying real estate. In many markets at current valuations and rates, it means owning the companies that own the real estate through liquid, diversified investment vehicles and deploying the saved capital into assets with better risk-adjusted returns. So here is where we land, and I want to give you 3 specific frameworks for thinking about this, rather than 3 pieces of advice, because advice has a shelf life and frameworks stay useful. First framework, always distinguish between the asset and the system that prices the asset. A home is a real physical thing with genuine utility, but its price is a product of a system, interest rates, supply constraints, zoning laws, tax policy, demographic demand, and that system changes. When people say real estate always goes up, they are conflating the asset with a favourable version of the pricing system that happened to be in place for a specific historical period. The asset does not always go up. The system drove it up under specific conditions. Understand the conditions, not just the outcome. Second framework, calculate the opportunity cost before you calculate the investment. Every financial decision has 2 parts. The expected return on the thing you're buying and the expected return on the next best alternative use of that same capital. Most people who celebrate their home's appreciation never ask the question, what would that down payment have returned in an index fund over the same period? The answer to that question is not always more than the house, but the question has to be asked, Otherwise, you are evaluating a financial decision with half the information. Third framework, value liquidity asymmetrically when you are young and your human capital is high. This is a concept that professional investors use constantly, but that almost never makes it into personal finance conversations. When you are 24, your largest asset is not your savings account. It is the 40 plus years of future earning potential you have in front of you, your human capital. And the most important thing about human capital is that it is location sensitive, opportunity sensitive, and best maximized when you are able to move toward the best opportunities. Locking your financial capital into an illiquid asset at 24, before you know which city you will be most successful in, before you know what career pivots you will need to make, before you know what the economy will look like in a decade, is a bet against your own optionality. The standard financial planning advice treats a mortgage as an expression of financial responsibility. The counter argument, which I find more compelling in the current environment, is that maintaining liquidity in your 20s is an expression of financial intelligence. You protect your ability to adapt to a system that is changing faster than any previous generation's financial assumptions accounted for. None of this means never buy a house. It means buy one when the math makes sense in your specific market, at your specific stage of life, with your specific alternative uses of capital in view. Not because you turn 30, not because your parents expect it, not because the real estate agent says prices are only going up from here, not because the culture decided a long time ago that the escalator was the only way to rise. The escalator still works. In some markets at some price points, stepping on is still the best financial decision available. But it is a decision, it should be made like a decision with numbers, with alternatives, with an honest view of what you are giving up and what you're getting, not with the quiet social pressure of a culture that built its identity around one asset class and has not yet reckoned with the fact that the asset class has changed. Gen Z reckoned with it early. Whether that reckoning leads to better outcomes will take 20 years to measure. But I will tell you this, I would rather be the generation that asked the question than the generation that kept buying tickets to an escalator without checking whether it still goes up. If this is the kind of analysis that is useful to you, subscribe. One video when the systems get interesting. No fluff, no motivation, just the actual mechanics of how money moves and why.